Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the DD Council's Thursday webinar series. Today, we have with us Jessica Brady and Rebecca McIntyre from the Michigan Department of Education, Office of Special Education, and they're going to share with us the latest guidance from the Office of Special Education to schools on that's out there that they've released for schools on the reopening from COVID. So just before we turn it over to them, just a couple things to remember. Today's session is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. After the session, the recordings will be available at ddi.wayne.edu/MDDC. Participant microphones will be on mute for the duration of the presentation, and we'll unmute the lines once it's time for Q&A. And the only videos you'll see today are those of the presenters. As an accommodation, closed captioning is provided. If you would like to turn on your closed captioning, there is an arrow to the right of the closed caption button. And if you click on that arrow, the top choice is show subtitles. So if you select show subtitles, the closed captioning will be turned on. For today's presentation, there are 3 ways to ask questions. One is using the Q&A window if you're connected by Zoom. The second is using the chat box to all panelists and attendees. And the third is to use the hand raise function. And you'll use the hand raise function if you wish to ask your question aloud. And we will allow you to speak, and then you'll unmute yourself and you'll be recognized. We'll allow you to speak and you'll unmute yourself and be able to ask your question. If you're watching us live on Facebook today, if you put your questions in the comment box, then your questions or comments will be read aloud on the Zoom meeting today. So without further ado, because no one's here to talk to me today, I'm going to introduce to you Rebecca McIntyre and Jessica Brady. And ladies, if you would like to introduce yourselves, I will, you can do that while I'm pulling up the guidance.
All right, thank you, Tedra. My name is Jessica Brady. I'm with the Michigan Department of Education in the Office of Special Education, and with me is, you're on mute.
Rebecca McIntyre. I am the supervisor of the Program Accountability Unit in the Office of Special Education.
Right, so today we are going to go through the guidance to address return to learn for students with IEPs. Tedra, thank you for having us today. This guidance that the Michigan Department of Education put out really does address the 2020-2021 school year. It is focusing on students with IEPs. So it's going to go through how do districts appropriately meet the requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And throughout this document, when we refer to IDEA, that refers to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and then the accompanying rules that Michigan has. So the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education, and in Michigan, we refer to them as MARS. And so IDEA and MARS really are the two packages, so policies and rules and regulations that districts need to follow in order to provide a free, appropriate public education and the least restrictive environment to our students with IEPs. And in Michigan, as you know, we serve children birth to 26 in Michigan. And so IDEA and MARS are what is really going to provide those rules and regulations so that districts can determine what needs to occur during those times. I also want to remind and tell people that IDEA, states were granted no waivers to IDEA during this pandemic period. So all of the requirements in IDEA need to be met. With that, the Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education determined that there needed to be guidance provided to districts because we know that during these challenging unprecedented times that school districts are providing education in a variety of ways. So we know some districts are fully virtual. Some districts are doing a hybrid. And when I say a hybrid, I mean they're doing potentially 2 days in person, 3 days virtual, or vice versa, or a combination thereof. And some are doing fully online. We also know that the governor has issued an executive order, and that executive order was issued on June 30th, 2020. It's Executive Order 2020-142. That outlines a few requirements and then some recommendations. One of the requirements talks about when schools are allowed to instruct students in person, when they have a choice, and when they are not allowed to instruct students in person at all. So the governor has put the state into regions, and then she has defined phases. Phases are when districts are allowed to instruct students in person. So if a region of the state is in a phase 1, 2, or 3, and you can find those regions in the governor's Michigan State Safe Start Plan, during a phase 1, 2, or 3, districts are not allowed to instruct students in person. That means that districts must do learning at a distance. So that could be paper and pencil packets, virtual, so Google Classroom, etc., those types of things, but students, staff are not allowed in buildings during phases 1, 2, or 3. In a phase 4, 5, or 6, if a region is in a phase 4, 5, or 6, district has a choice on whether or not instruction is going to take place either virtually, hybrid, or in person. And so when we're looking through this document, we need to make sure that you keep in mind this document is talking about when we're in phases 4, 5, and 6 and a district has a choice. If a district is in a phase 1, 2, or 3, district must be in a virtual setting. So learning at a distance. Okay, the executive order also talks about every single district must have a preparedness plan. And that preparedness plan is a plan that addresses the entire district, so students with and without disabilities, and how are they going to instruct students when they are teaching students in a modality from learning at a distance. So if you want more information on that Executive Order 2020-142, TEDRA has that guidance document up, and those are active links that you can click on, and it will take you to that executive order. You can look at the Michigan Safe Start Plan and the Return to School Roadmap, and it gives you all of the things that either the governor says are requirements, depending upon the region and the phase that region is in, and then some recommendations that the governor has for the different phases and region, the phases that a region may be in. So the other thing that this document does is it talks about this is proactive. We're asking districts to be proactive in their approach to instruction for students with IEPs. We know that in March of last year, the pandemic, no one was expecting that we would be in a pandemic throughout the country. And so when the state all of a sudden closed down, the Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education came out with guidance, and we said districts provide a good faith effort in providing education, instruction programs, special education programs and services to students with IEPs. That lasted for the 1920 school year. That no longer is in effect for the 2020-2021 school year. So we know that IDEA, as I said before, has been granted no waivers. So students need to be afforded a free, appropriate public education. So the Michigan Department of Education is recommending a contingency learning plan be in place for students with IEPs. I want to be clear that contingency learning plans are not required in IDEA nor MARS. They are not referenced in IDEA or MARS. They are not required. So districts have a choice on whether or not they would like to reference a contingency learning plan in an IEP. And I say reference because the contingency learning plan is not going to be in the IEP. It is going to be referenced in the IEP so that the triggering events will be in the IEP. So when would the contingency learning plan be implemented? Would be in the IEP. The contingency learning plan we're recommending be outside of that IEP. So that contingency learning plan talks about what program services would the child get if he or she would not be learning in a brick and mortar setting. It looks at the need of the child and how can the district provide for that child's needs in a remote setting. And so how we have, and we, meaning the Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education, has set up this document is we have gone through and we've set up 6 priority areas. And Rebecca's going to take you through those 6 priority areas. We'll stop, have people ask questions, and then we've gone through and we've done some topic areas. And then the office has received a lot of questions. We've done a frequently asked questions section, and then we will stop for questions. And then we always have in our documents a portion where there's a sheet of paper where you can go in and ask questions that the public can submit to the Office of Special Education. And that's where we kind of garner where we're going to go with our next guidance document. Okay, so Rebecca, you want to take it away? You're on mute again.
Okay, I just want to address one question before we get started that I see in the chat box. So as you spoke, the question came in, why does it have to be a district's choice to offer contingency learning plans? Can't MDE mandate it? And so I think we go back to the fact that a contingency learning plan is not a requirement of the IDEA or the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education, and therefore it's not something that can be mandated, but it can be strongly recommended. So it's not a technically under IDEA a part of what makes up FAPE. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this document established 6 priority topics for districts to focus on for the fall of 2020. So if you can scroll up just a little bit, Tedra, that would be great. So the first topic is establishing and ensuring that each student with an IEP has a free, appropriate public education or an IEP in place to start the school year. So we know that back when the closures first started back in March until now, there were many IEPs that came due, annual reviews that came due, that parents were either unwilling or unable to participate virtually in those meetings. And as a result, IEP annual review due dates lapsed, which means there are late IEPs. So one of the priorities is, and it does follow the IDEA's requirement, at the beginning of each school year, each public agency must have an effect for each child with a disability within its jurisdiction, an IEP. So that first and foremost is what needs to happen. As those conversations take place, we are encouraging districts to, when there are new IEPs that are being held, have the conversations with Iep teams, including parent, because we want meaningful participation in that, about whether or not there's a need for a contingency learning plan. And if there is a need for a contingency learning plan, what are the specific and individualized triggers that would would be cause for the implementation of that contingency learning plan. And those would be, unique for each student. So the IEP that is being developed to start the year should be a full offer of FAPE that's based on the unique needs of each individual child with a disability, based on a brick and mortar setting. So that is something that the IDEA requires, and we firmly believe that we need to have that full offer of FAPE. Now, because of the nature of the public health emergency and the fact that there are going to be times where students are in-person learning and where they may have to go learning in a remote or a hybrid type setting, that contingency learning plan and identifying triggers of when a contingency learning plan would be implemented is something that is going to allow for programs and services and supports to be implemented seamlessly for the students, so they can move into that brick and mortar setting and have their full offer of FAPE. And then if one of those triggering events happens and they have to move back into a remote setting, then there's already a plan in place of how those supports will be provided, and the students' unique needs would be met. So that's what those conversations would be about. We fully expect and anticipate collaborative conversations with families regarding the development of those, and whether or not they are needed. There may be some students who are on a speech-only IEP where a contingency learning plan is not needed. But there are students who there may be the need for one. Go ahead and scroll down just a little bit. So as I had said, okay, you can stop right there. What we have here with similar to a behavior intervention plan. So for those of you who are familiar with behavior intervention plans, if you picture in an IEP, there's a supplementary aid and service or an accommodation that typically you write in a behavior intervention plan. Or a health plan or an emergency intervention plan, but those plans are referenced in the IEP, and then there are the triggering events for that. This would be the very same thing. You would reference the need for a contingency learning plan in the IEP, identify the triggers where that plan would be implemented, but the actual development of the plan would be outside of the IEP. And let's see, so as I had said previously, there are annual reviews that are going to be due. So for those, you would discuss the need for a contingency learning plan at those meetings and reference those in there. In other cases where an IEP is not overdue, those conversations should still be happening with families to determine whether or not those contingency learning plans are needed, and then they can actually be referenced and added into an IEP, the reference to them in the IEP through an amendment. So, which does not require a full Iep team meeting, but it does require agreement between the parent and the district. So some triggering events, go ahead and scroll down to the bottom of this priority. There you go. So the MDEOS has identified some possible triggering events, but like we said, this is the individualized portion of this conversation with the IEP team. And so a particular student doesn't necessarily have all of these triggering events. They may have 1, 2, or 3 of them, or they may have something different. This is not an exhaustive list. This would just be the most common. And contingency learning plans are specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there wouldn't be a contingency learning plan for something that would be outside of that. What if a district is placed in phase 1, 2, or 3, as Jessica said, when you're in one of those phases, you cannot have in-person instruction. So that is a time when a contingency learning plan would be critical to have in place. If a district chooses, or if the parent chooses a remote option during phases 4, 5, or 6, if a district chooses a hybrid model, or if there's student illness or household member who is quarantined due to exposure or one of those high risk categories. So we said those are just, it's not an exhaustive list, but those would be some possible triggering events. So we'd see contingency learning plan written in the IEP, and then which of those, if any, or others triggers would be the frequency at which it would be triggered. Okay, so once a full offer of FAPE is in place and a contingency learning plan is referenced in the IEP, and with those identified triggers, then and notices provided, then outside of the IEP meeting, priority topic number 2 is developing a contingency learning plan. And so, as we said, first and foremost, we want that current IEP in place and referenced. So a plan should not be developed if it's not sitting in as a reference in the IEP. And if there hasn't been some sort of conversation or agreement with the parent. We do not expect these to be imposed upon families. These are something that is, it's a collaborative effort to figure out what supports would a student require in a virtual or hybrid type setting. Yes, this is the part where there's meaningful participation still. So with the development of the contingency learning plan being outside of the IEP, what we would expect to see is not necessarily that what is developed at the outset is going to be a perfect model for support, but we're going to be collecting data. We're going to be getting parent input on their, is the student is able to access? Are they engaging? Are the supports that are currently in place enough? And then updating those and adjusting those as needed based on the student needs and the parent input. And so having that plan sit outside of the IEP allows for adjustments to be made outside of an IEP team meeting. So we would expect to see that continuously reviewing and adjusting. Just because it's developed doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And then we have a section here that as teams, go ahead and scroll down onto the next page, second paragraph. Yep, there we go. So we do have, we have put a website on here. An IDE grant funded initiative is called Alt+Shift. So that's a hyperlink to it. That's the actual name of the website or the actual grant funded initiative. And it's not what you do on the keyboard. So, and they provide free technical assistance regarding alternate strategies to learning. And so that is it's a great resource to check out. We remind districts to consider some strategies through there as well as families. All right, let's see. And then we'll scroll down a little bit more. As Jessica had said, as we developed this guidance, we wanted to try and stay consistent and embed the concepts within the Michigan Safe Start Plan and the Return to School Roadmap, as well as the executive order. And so looking at those, keeping those in mind, the times when we definitely want to utilize those contingency learning plans. Obviously, as we had said, in phases 1, 2, or 3, contingency learning plans are critically important for students with IEPs. They are going to keep that learning going. When the state or region moves into 4, 5, or 6, and districts are allowed to choose their mode of instruction, then that's something that, again, in order to support a fluid approach to learning, and maybe some days or some weeks in school, but others out of school, it's going to allow the student a back and forth fluid motion, without having a disruption to their learning. We still feel like that is highly important for students and for their families who are supporting them. And then the last section we have here with the federal IDEA requires FAPE to be provided. And so districts who are choosing to provide 100% remote instruction during 4, 5, and 6, they may be able to provide FAPE remotely, but it is also possible that a student may require some in-person instruction. Think physical therapy. So those are services, not necessarily instruction, but if they require in-person services or specially designed instruction, then that's something that the district would have to that's part of their obligation to make that available, and which could potentially also include transportation needs. Okay. So that's topic 3. So now we have a full offer of FAPE and we have a contingency learning plan developed. So priority topic 3 is to consider a need for parent counseling and training. So under the IDEA, there is a related service that, in my opinion, gets often overlooked. It's called parent counseling and training. And the purpose is to assist parents in acquiring skills to support the implementation of their child's IEP. So that can look very differently depending on the child and depending on the parent and their current set of skills. But it could be, helping them understand their child's educational needs, providing them with information about child development, information about placement in special education if it's an initial IEP, and providing information about parent contacts and supports, financial assistance. So those are, again, not an exhaustive list, and the IDEA did not anticipate a global pandemic. And so this is one of those related services that can be considered, especially now that there are more children learning in their homes where parents are supporting implementation of IEPs. And so, what support can be provided to parents, or what training can be provided to help them support and implement those IEPs. We do have a link as well to the Michigan Alliance for Families website. If you can scroll down just a little bit more. Okay. So there's Michigan Alliance for Families. It's another IDEA grant-funded initiative. They provide free information, support, and education for families of students with disabilities, birth to 26 years old. So that is available for anyone to access. Just a couple of examples that we had, and these are not exhaustive in any way, but in the preceding paragraphs we had, for students who are in a full virtual learning, or MDE is calling them technology-enabled instruction at a distance, some of that parent training may include technology, training them on how to use technology, how to help their child use technology, especially if there's some very specific assistive technologies that are available. It could also be providing them training on how to participate in virtual IEP meetings. Those are a couple of things. For non-technology enabled instruction at a distance, it could be you have students with prompting, cueing, hand over hand, things like that in their IEPs or part of their goals. And so showing parents and providing some training on how to continue the use of those or how to do those properly could also be part of that parent training and counseling. So, but there's a host of options that they have, and so we're just really encouraging districts to consider that. If not in the IEP as a general related service, it could be included in the contingency learning plan, because that's what's going to follow the student into the home. So, okay.
Rebecca, are you ready for some questions?
We are going to, if it's all right, we're going to move through all of these 5 topics, and, oh, sorry, 6 topics, and then we'll come back and do the questions before we move on to the rest of the document. Is that all right?
Sure.
Or how are we doing on time? What do you want to do, Jessica?
I guess we can take a couple of it's up to you, Rebecca. It's 11:30. We have till 12:30, I think, Tedra, right?
That is correct. We're on priority topic 4. So as you stated in your introduction, Jessica, we'll go through the 6 priority
Okay.
topics and then we'll take questions.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, so priority topic number 4 is regarding informal assessments. So as students return to school, we're looking and collecting informal assessments for each student to determine what their current instructional level is. So as we know, every student, general education and special education, experienced some loss. There was a disruption in learning for all students, so they've all experienced a universal loss of some sort. So for our students with IEPs, you know, there's going to be that universal loss, but then there's going to be additional impact. And so that's what we want to get to the heart of. What was that additional impact? And so, you know, really having general education teachers and special education teachers collaborating and collecting data and on those informal assessments to determine what those current instructional levels are so that we can see what that additional impact is. Teams are going to look at data that was available prior to the closures back in March, so any data points that they have available then, as well as data that's available during the closures. Now that data is going to be coming more so from parents, so observations, like we said, input on what was the student's engagement level, were they able to access, looking at all of that information and really relying on parents and any of the general education or special education instruction that was able to be provided, as well as some informal assessment tools that will be used upon return to school now in the fall that can be given frequently and is sensitive to change. So you're going to see those little progress or no progress, being able to collect those over time, over shorter periods of time. So that will be priority number 4. Priority number 5 then is we're taking all that data that was collected and we're looking at that actual impact. Okay, so this section actually came out of one of our previous documents that we've had, our recovery services document, as we're looking at what was that actual impact, and based on that, is there a need for, or are recovery services warranted for the student? So recovery services is another concept that is not in the IDEA, it's not in MARS, and therefore it cannot be mandated. It's strongly recommended. We did look at other states, and some states are calling them COVID impact services, others are calling them compensatory services, impact services. So we chose the term recovery services, but they're all along the same thing. They are different than the term of compensatory education, because compensatory education, as you'll hear at the end of the document, is something that is awarded. This is compensatory services. So, you know, how do we address that impact and get the student to the point where they can begin making progress again? So we have some information in here. So when a team is determining whether recovery services are warranted for a student, they would be looking at what was the amount of instruction that was provided during the closure from March to June. Was the student able to access the technology? Were they able to receive any special education services during that time? Could they work on their goals and objectives? So knowing that information is key under there. Also, as I said, information and observations from parents and any other child care providers that may have been with the child during that time. So knowing their level of engagement and their ability to access. Go ahead and scroll down a little bit further, Tedra, if you could please. And then knowing what their level of academic achievement and functional performance was prior to the interruption of services and what it is now. And then what's their progress. So looking at their progress reports on in the general ed curriculum compared to their grade level peers and on their IEP goals compared to their I guess they're students with other students with disabilities. And then their prior need for extended school year services. So information, you know, have they historically had troubles with the regression recoupment and making progress after extended breaks in time. And so considering those and if there was any summer learning opportunities that were available to the student as well. And then we do have a link to our guidance to address foregone learning for students with IEPs during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the document that was developed to introduce the concept of recovery services and you know, what those would entail and how decisions would be made. So once a district does determine whether or not they're going to utilize recovery services, which by the way, recovery services can be provided during the course of the regular school day, which is different, very different than compensatory education, which can only be provided outside the course of the regular school day. So once they determine whether recovery services are warranted for students, then they're going to prioritize those. So we know that there are students who did not receive any special education services or they were unable to access during that learning at a distance, or they have newly identified needs. So like I said, with the lack of engagement, socialization, maybe there's some mental health needs with anxiety or PTSD that comes out of this whole pandemic. And so being able to recognize what those barriers are for those students and put some recovery services in place that can meet those needs so the student can begin making progress again sooner rather than later is going to be key here. Recovery services are something that the general recommendation was to make determinations by December of 2020. And so considering those students who did not have any access or have those new and emerging needs, December is definitely going to be too late there, which is why we said, you know, consider a priority for those for sure. So just some examples of recovery services. We always have the, you know, it's right there. It's those bullets at the top of this page. So we always get the question, what would a recovery service look like? So we still we say it can be provided during the course of the regular school day, but that doesn't mean we're saying pull the student out of class so they can get the services that they missed on a one-to-one type basis. Okay, recovery services, that's not what we're talking about here. They don't have to be replicated. It does not have to be something that's already sitting in an IEP as a support or a service. And it does not need to be at the one-to-one, this is how much we missed, so this is how much they're going to get. And so think on terms of least restrictive, like a continuum for the student. So I'm going to give an example of a student with some speech language supports that they get services, they miss some direct services. Would want to think in terms of least restrictive for the student first. Is there assistive technology that might be available that we can put in the hands of that student in order for him to or her to make progress again and get to that point where they're making progress? Or other social emotional behavioral type supports for the student. Could we provide consult to maybe the parent or the general education teacher or the special education teacher, some consultation services to help the student generalize skills and get them going? Because if we're just working on a one-on-one setting with the student, then it's only recovering that progress to that one-on-one setting. And we want them to be able to generalize their skills back out. Maybe it is providing additional push-in supports or services, or some direct services. Could be providing peer-to-peer supports. So it could be a host of things, and it's going to be very individualized conversation, but it does not need to compromise least restrictive environment for the student by taking them out of learning with their general education peers. All right.
Right, are we ready for question and answer, Rebecca?
Yes.
All right, do you want me to look, I know we have a couple in the chat box that I can see. Tedra, do you want me to go over those first?
We
So
have,
let's go to those two, and in the interest of time, we have one hand raised, we have 4 in the Q&A, and we have we've got 5 in the Q&A, and we've got what's in the chat, so we'll take those, and then we will keep moving.
Okay, so
go ahead and start with the chat, Jessica, if you want.
okay, so what are the implications of a FAPE for students with disabilities when a district located in phase 4 or 5 chooses to only offer remote instruction but develops a contingency learning plan because they can't fully implement the student's IEP? And this goes back to when we were talking about that you develop a full offer of FAPE based on a brick and mortar, and then you document what triggers a contingency learning plan, one being that the parent or district is offering remote instruction. So the student's going to be in a remote instruction environment. That contingency learning plan, remember, still addresses the student's needs. So you're looking at how do you address the student's needs in a remote setting. So that still is a different offer of a free appropriate public education. So you're looking at what is the student's needs and how would you offer those, what program services does the student need, and how can you address those needs in a remote setting? I don't know, Rebecca, if you need to say, if you want to say anything else.
No, that's good.
Okay. Excuse me, I've got like a frog or something in my throat. And then we have would be cause for implementation of the contingency learning unique for each student. So the IEP that is being developed to start the year would be the full offer of FAPE based on the unique needs of each individual child with a disability based on a brick and mortar setting. Yes. You develop the IEP based on a brick and mortar setting, and that's a full offer of free appropriate public education. We just went through your contingency learning plan is still an offer of FAPE based upon the needs of the child. It's just based on the needs of a child and how you can deliver and address those needs in a remote or learning at a distance setting.
Okay, so there are 4 questions in the Q&A. Mary, would you go ahead and read those?
yes, from Heather, we have, if summer learning opportunities were made available to students with IEPs beyond ESY, can recovery services still be considered determined by the IEP in addition to what the district made available during the summer?
So the answer to that would be yes. A student can be eligible for extended school year. They can participate in summer learning opportunities, but when the IEP team comes together and they've collected data before the closure, during the closure, and after the closure, if there is still additional impact that needs to be addressed, then it is possible that recovery services may be warranted. That's going to be a very individualized decision for each student. And it should not be a blanket that they automatically would get that. Because as one thing, and I don't know if I said it, but in regard to recovery services, the purpose of them is to get them back to the point they were in March so they can start making progress again. It's not to get them beyond that. Once they get back to where they were, then recovery services would not be warranted any further.
Okay. The next question comes from Colleen. If a child is in all-day instructional learning and needs recovery services on top of that instructional learning, when are they supposed to get the recovery services, if not outside the usual school day?
So for that one, as we said, so recovery services are permitted to be provided during the course of the regular school day, but they can also be provided outside. So they don't have to be. It is possible, like I said, if you think in terms of a continuum from least restrictive to most, depending on what that actual impact is, it could just be additional supports that need to be provided to the student. Like I said, assisted technology supports, peer-to-peer supports, additional accommodations, something along that line. Before we just jump straight to, we're going to pull them out of general education so they can make up specially designed instruction missed time, because it might not be that they need that extent of services. Again, it's going to be very individualized.
Okay. Mitchell writes, 3 questions related to CLPs. 1, would MDE recognize a substantive right for a student's parent to provide meaningful input in the development of a student's CLP?
Yes. If there is, and that's part of our guidance in the governor's executive order as well, is that the guidance coming out of the Office of Special Education Programs at the federal level and at the state, and any guidance developed by the state, those are compliance issues. And so districts need to follow those in terms of compliance. And so we have said that when developing an IEP, you're referencing the need for a contingency learning plan and those individual triggers, and then meaningful participation outside of that in the development of the contingency learning plan.
Okay. 2 is the CPL the offer of FAPE once triggered?
So yes, it is considered like the backup plan. It's not the offer of FAPE. That's why we say it's very important that there is a full offer of FAPE on the table, because that's truly what the student is entitled to in a brick and mortar 6.5-hour day setting. So that should not change. IEPs are designed based on a student's unique needs and not on a setting and not on a situation. And so it's very important to keep that full offer of FAPE in place. However, when that brick and mortar setting is not an option and that full offer of FAPE cannot be implemented, then you have that backup plan available. And so it's kind of like the backup offer of FAPE is what it is. And you're still meeting the unique needs of the student and supporting those in when they're designed so that the student is still able to make progress in the general ed curriculum. They're still able to make progress on their IEP goals and objectives. They have those supports, and a district should be constantly looking at those to make sure that those supports are actually sufficient to support the student needs. And it's not just develop it and we're done.
Okay. 3rd part of the question. While CLPs are outside the IDEA framework and cannot be mandated if included, CLPs are incorporated by reference in IEPs. Because of that inclusion in IEPs, once the CLP is triggered, are the services in the CLP covered by the IDEA's due process protections?
Yes, they are. They would be covered under implementation. as well as not just contingency learning plans, but recovery services. If a district writes recovery services in an IEP, that they're going to be providing those, whether it be in the anticipated needs section or wherever that is. If they develop that plan to provide those, then those also would be fall under and have due process protections under implementation.
Okay, one last question from the chat. Stephen writes, how is equity guaranteed if recovery services are only recommended?
So when we look at equity, remember, because there's been no waivers to IDEA, there's always due process protections when looking at, you can go to state complaints, due process hearings, mediations. So if a parent or other stakeholder wants to file a state complaint on implementation, or a student has not received a free appropriate public education, there's always an opportunity to do so. Of course, there is mediation facilitated IEP that we would recommend going to try and work with the district. Those things have not been waived. There's still a right to do so. So although districts do not have to look to see if recovery services are warranted, all of the other regulations in IDEA are still present and afforded to students with IEPs. So districts are obligated to look at those things, or parents, stakeholders have a right to any of the processes in IDEA. But we do encourage parents and districts to work together. These are unprecedented times, and we do think that districts and parents did the best that they could during these times. And so we would look at, looking at mediation, facilitated IEP development, and all of that. I don't know, Rebecca, you want to say anything else?
Nope, that was a good response.
That was the last question from the chat. I see no further hand raised, and we've cleared the questions from Q&A.
All right, so Rebecca's going to take you through further considerations, and then we'll stop, take a few more questions, and then I'll take you through frequently asked questions.
Okay, so under further considerations, and before I get into this, I wanted to say each of the guidance documents that have been issued out of the MDEOs, at the bottom of them, they have a feedback form, a link to a feedback form. We also have that feedback form on our MDEOs COVID-19 website. And so what we're looking for there is for individuals who have suggestions for topics that they would like us to discuss in future guidance, or if they have questions, they can submit those there. If they are questions that need immediate assistance, we will have our MDEO's information line reach out. But really what we're doing is we're looking at trends, because we are not in the field. It's hard for us to stay ahead of the issues if we're not aware of what the issues are or what the field is experiencing. So we have utilized that tool to enter some additional information in here. So we've captured them under further considerations, because we have received a lot of questions about Iep team meetings, secondary transition, and behavior. So that's where this information comes from, based on the feedback from that feedback form. So in regards to Iep team meetings, and as Jessica pointed out, there have been no waivers to any of the IDEA requirements. And so therefore, the questions that have been coming in about Iep team meetings and can we hold them in person? Can we just hold them all virtually? What does that look like? So that's what we're trying to address here. So in-person meetings are permissible under phases 4, 5, or 6. So 1, 2, or 3, they're not permissible, and what you're falling back on is the requirement under IDEA to offer alternate options, whether that be phone conference or Skype or something else, some alternate way of meeting if you're in a phase 1, 2, or 3. If you're under phase 4, 5, or 6, in-person meetings are permissible. And so it's not an option just for a district to say, we are only holding virtual IEP meetings. There needs to be that option first and foremost for an in-person meeting. Social distancing and other personal protection equipment obviously is something that would have to be followed. However, you know, if that in-person meeting is something that all parties agree on, is not something they want to move forward with, then you can look at alternate options of those virtually or by telephone. So we have encouraged staff to consider, districts to consider staffing needs to address annual IEPs, and really even considering all of those IEPs that were not able to be held between March and June 30 because of, like I had said, either parent unwillingness or unable to meet virtually. And so those all have to be completed now, as well as all the IEPs that are coming due naturally this time of year. So you know, really considering those staffing needs and the fact that there are no waivers to IDEA requirements, and so those timelines are still expected to be met. The second one is in regard to transition, secondary transition. So with secondary transition, many of the times students are out and about in the community. And so in this case, if you are in a phase 1, 2, or 3, that's obviously something that's not going to be able to happen. And even in 4, 5, or 6, there are in-person opportunities. It is permissible to meet in person. However, there may be some types of community-based outings that students are not going to be able to participate in. And so really taking a look at looking at each individual student's transition needs and trying to identify what alternate strategies might be available to meet those transition needs, and if necessary, looking at an alternate type of transition plan or adjusting the transition plan to meet those needs so the student is able to participate still and make progress on their transition plan. And then we do have at the bottom of this section, if you can scroll down just a little bit, you know, we do recommend that before districts actually begin their community-based instruction, that they consult with their local health department in order to determine the best and most safe way to do that, considering the health and safety needs of the students and staff. And then we have a link here to our the MDE's COVID-19 and Career Technical Education Resources page. They do have some online or virtual distance learning options available for students ages 16 to 26, students with IEPs ages 16 to 26. And so we would recommend that you check those out. All right. And then the third trend that came through that feedback form had to do with behavior. And so how is behavior addressed in a remote setting? And so, and even for students who are coming back into a building after this pandemic. And so keeping in mind that all students, really general education and special education, have experienced some sort of adverse experience during this period of school closure. And so being able to recognize that, and is it engagement, socialization, are there increased behavioral or behavior incidences, and that need to be supported, and just being cognizant of that, and implementing PBIS, would still reduce the need for disciplinary removals. So the IDEA does require the consideration of PBI, or positive behavior intervention supports, and other strategies to address behavior. And so this is something that, regardless of the setting that a student is in, and whether they're on an IEP or they're on a contingency learning plan, supporting behavior, and which could be something like engagement, is something that is a standard in the IDEA. And also keeping in mind, although it could be difficult to develop and would rely very heavily on parent input, behavior intervention plans are something that, even though the student is not in a brick and mortar, can still be developed for students who are in a virtual setting. So keeping that in mind as well. We do have some information in here from the My MTSS team, and we do have linked to their Technical Assistance Center. They have some specific COVID-19 resources that will help parents, will help school districts with the learning at a distance and supporting behavior. Because whether students are in person or they are at a distance, we have to create a positive, predictable, and safe environment for students. And so the My MTSS Technical Assistance Center has some resources for that.
All right, so that was that section. Do we have any questions on that section?
We do have one question in the chat. Aaron writes, questions regarding CLPs. With the option of using a contingency learning plan, if a student has a letter from a physician that they shouldn't attend due to concerns about COVID, what is the recommendation regarding the use of homebound/hospitalized districts have often reverted to 2 non-contingent hours a week rather than a full consideration of FAPE when utilizing homebound? Has the requirement for homebound changed with the new requirements regarding attendance being counted by 2 contacts a week?
The requirements for homebound have not changed. We are back in the spring, there was a waiver that was specific to not needing a physician statement. We are looking at the need for waivers again right now, but nothing has been decided with that. So are you able to put that question back up there? I want to make sure I get all, let me go back to it. I want to make sure I get all parts. Okay. So yes, the actual pupil accounting is what requires the 2 non-consecutive hours a week. But it would be something that if it's through a contingency learning plan and they're being supported in the home, then it's something that, they would need to look at what additional supports. That to me is a little different than homebound hospitalized services. A contingency learning plan would have additional supports and services above and beyond what homebound hospitalized might have. Jessica?
Yeah, I think there's 2 routes. I think the question, and let me pull it up too. Oops. Oh, okay.
It's under if you click on the answered, it's the very last one.
So I think there's 2 different things that potentially could be going on here. There's the use of homebound hospitalized in an IEP because there's a doctor's note, and then there's an event was triggered in the IEP that says that the contingency learning plan is now going to be in effect. The contingency learning plan is, as Rebecca referred to it, your backup offer, right, of free appropriate public education. You're still looking at the needs of the student, addressing those needs through programs and services that may not look like what you're offering in a brick and mortar. But when you're looking at homebound and you're putting homebound in the IEP, that's a very specific requirement in MARS, right? That you've got your 2 non-consecutive hours a week, those things. Your contingency learning plan may or may not have homebound in it, right? I think that's the difference. Do you think that too, Rebecca?
Yes, because homebound hospitalized typically would just be written in the IEP.
Correct. So you can have a contingency learning plan and not have homebound hospitalized in it. And to have a contingency learning plan, you do not have to have a physician's note.
We have a new question from the same person. Non-consecutive is not non-contingent. If you can make
Oh, no, I think she was correcting herself. She meant to say non-consecutive, not.
Okay.
All right, so let's go through the frequently asked questions. And these came from a multitude of sources, but they came from, it wasn't just one person or one district, one entity asking. And so we determined that it would be best for us to put it in this document so that it would be answered one time consistently, and everyone would have the answer. So the first one is, how should districts prepare for the return of students with disabilities who may be medically fragile or immunocompromised to in-person instruction? And we first talk about health and safety must be the primary consideration when determining how to meet the needs of students with disabilities. And so then we say, make sure you're reviewing the list of the list of the Federal Center for Disease Control and Prevention for those that are at higher risk of severe illness when exposed to the coronavirus. And then go to your local health department and talk to them about what you should be doing. We also have the Michigan Association of School Nurses. We have a school nurse consultant at the Michigan Department of Education that we share with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And so we're really asking parents, districts to consult with the Center for Disease Control, look at your local health department, and what are they recommending to make sure that health and safety is being looked at for each and every student on an individualized basis to support each student. So then the next, if a student's resident district is providing instruction at a distance, but the student is placed in a center-based program in another district that is providing in-person instruction, must the resident district continue to provide transportation? So you have a student living in one district, but is being instructed in a center-based program in another district that is in person. Resident district is learning at a distance. The operating district is a center-based program and they're in person. The resident district must provide transportation to the center-based program in another district, unless there is an agreement between the resident district and the operating or center-based program that says otherwise. The third being, if a student's resident district is providing instruction at a distance, but the student is placed in a center-based program in another district that is providing in-person instruction, and which mode of instruction does the student participate? The student will participate in the mode of instruction where they are receiving instruction, unless the contingency learning plan is triggered. So if the district opts to use a contingency learning plan and it's noted in the IEP, the triggers, and the contingency learning plan is triggered, then they would use the contingency learning plan. In all other instances, a student is going to be being instructed in the mode of instruction where they go to school. So in this instance, the center-based program is providing instruction in person, right? So that the student would be going in person unless the contingency learning plan has been triggered. May districts provide in-person homebound instruction, sorry. Remember, this goes back to our phases and the executive order. We have to, Michigan and districts have to follow the executive order. And if a region is in phase 1, 2, or 3, we are not allowed to do in-person instruction. When a region is operating in a phase 4, 5, or 6, the district can operate in person, virtually. If they're giving parents a choice, it is a choice for every single student. So that needs to be the case for every student, that parents can choose if they want virtual or in person. So we recommend that districts look for a recommendation from their local health department. And then everyone needs to look at what region and what phase the district is in that the child's going to school in, to see if you're in a phase 1, 2, or 3, not allowed to go in person. 4, 5, or 6, you have an option if the district is offering options. When do the waivers for 340.1754 and 340.1755 expire? They went through September 30th, or they are going through September 30th, 2020. We are looking at waivers right now. We have not had any waivers as of yet. They are, I think right now, being drafted, and we are going to, the Michigan Department of Education is going to determine whether waivers should be granted. That is based upon waivers that go through the legislator, the governor's office, and then we look at what waivers in general have been granted, and then we determine what waivers need to be granted based upon the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education. What is a district's obligation with respect to having an IEP in effect for a child transitioning from Part C? And many of you know Part C in Michigan is early on. That's our Birth to 3 program. To Part B, no later than the child's 3rd birthday. So in Michigan, you know, we have some timelines that are in calendar days and some timelines that are in school days. When we talk about our children that are participating in early on, and they were participating in early on, and they were also eligible for Michigan mandatory special education. So they were they had special education services and they had early on services. We said that they are potentially eligible for our Part B of IDEA. Those children must be determined if they are eligible for Part B of IDEA and have an IEP implemented by their 3rd birthday. And that's a requirement of IDEA. So that is a calendar requirement in IDEA. So part of the problem is that during this executive order, the state was closed down. And we were talking about there was no waivers. So some of the districts are going to be in non-compliance because you have to have potentially evaluations or at least a read done, a review of existing evaluation data, and they didn't do any of those things. Now we're coming up that districts may be in a little bit of a bind because they have an influx, because they have to do evaluations, reads for many kids that they didn't do, and now they have birthdays coming up, etc., that they may not have enough staff. So, but they still have the timelines because this is a calendar year. So we are saying that districts need to look at, can you do evaluations virtually, telephone, video conference, etc. We know that if a region's in 4, 5, or 6, you can do them in person. Now, parents may or may not want to do that, and we have to look at, remember saying, meaningful participation from a parent. We need to get agreement. It needs to be in consultation with the parent. And with COVID, there is even more reason that we need to make sure that the parent is comfortable having their child be okay with an in-person meeting being held with an IEP. So when we're looking at that, we have to say, can an evaluator evaluate if in person, or can they do it remotely? If that's not possible, there may need to be a delay. In that case, the district is going to be in violation of IDEA. We are recommending that the child still be provided services, and then look at whether or not recovery services may be appropriate in the interim. If the evaluator read IEP can be done virtually, then, or in person, we suggest that be done, and then continue doing all the services programs as appropriate. The next question has to do with Part B funds, and can they be used to purchase remote learning devices technology for a child with a disability? And the answer is yes, but you have to remember that if a district is purchasing something for students in general education, those things need to be purchased for everybody. And then the excess costs can be, the excess things that a student with an IEP needs can be purchased with Part B funds. So if you are purchasing a computer for everybody in a school, then it needs to be purchased for a student with an IEP and as well. If there is something that a student with an IEP needs in addition as an add-on, then you can use Part B funds in order to do that. How should districts proceed with evaluations when the school year starts? So we should be looking at, were there evaluations delayed or did not occur to COVID-19 during the spring? So really, districts should be prioritizing. Did evaluations not start? Were there evaluations requested and they couldn't happen? Were reevaluations due that didn't happen? Administrators need to be looking at the number of evaluations that were delayed or did not occur because of the executive order, and then take proactive measures to begin scheduling those and completing those evaluations as quickly as possible. We know that there's going to be some personnel shortages, and districts may need to have cooperative agreements amongst each other to try and get these things going, and evaluations to start taking place, and child-defined activities within the required timeline. We have been hearing that there has been personnel shortages because teachers aren't able to go in person because they are high risk. So we do know that there have been backlogs because of evaluations in the spring, and now it's the beginning of the school year. And evaluations, initial evaluations, remember, are in school days. So you have 30 school days to do initial evaluations. The next, we talk about in-person instruction. And we talked a little bit about that. We need to follow the return to school roadmap that has to do with your phases 1, 2, and 3, phases 4, 5, and 6, and when a district can and cannot do in-person instruction. And so you need to go back to that return to school roadmap, look at the requirements, and then the recommendations. Then we talk about what should a school district do when it cannot meet the 30 school day timeline for initial special education evaluations due to COVID-19. Unlike our early on to Part B by the third birthday, we talk about the 30 school day timeline for initial special education evaluations. So this is a 30 school day timeline. There are 2 exceptions to the 30 school day timeline. And these are in IDEA, and we give you the regulation that you can look at if you'd like. We look at, there's an exception to the 30 school day timeline if a parent of a child repeatedly fails or refuses to produce the child, if they enroll in another school or another public agency. And then we talk about if the district is making sufficient progress to ensure a prompt completion of the evaluation and the parent and public agency agree to a specific time when the evaluation will be completed. So then you can extend the timeline from the 30 school day timeline to complete that evaluation, and then the district would not be in non-compliance. And we go back to, can the district do the evaluation in a virtual setting? And so we will, districts should, and evaluators should be looking at that. Can you look at can you review existing evaluation data and be looking at that as well in order to determine eligibility? We also talk about if you're doing a reevaluation and the district feels that the eligibility category may not be appropriate. That does not mean that the student is not eligible for special education. We have to remember that eligibility category does not equal programs and services. It is the student receives what their need is based upon the needs that they have, not their eligibility category. So the student should remain eligible and receive, based upon their need, the program services that they have based upon their present level, and then the skills gaps and all of those things that are required in IDEA. What is the district's obligation to a child not yet eligible, where there is a delay in the ability to complete assessments as part of an initial evaluation? Talked a little bit about that in the Part C, your early on to B transition. Look and see if you can do an evaluation virtually. Write a contingency learning plan so that the student is receiving something, program services based upon their need. Look and see if there's a review of existing evaluation data. If there's additional evaluation that identifies evaluations that the student needs. The student may need some recovery services. And this is where we get into if there's a change in eligibility. And we keep going back to, this does apply to our children that are 3 to 5 as well. We had some people that were confused and thought it was just for our K-12 population. This does go for our 3 to 26-year-olds, that all of our students that are eligible in Michigan we need to be looking at this for. And then I think, is Jan on? Jan, do you want to do compensatory education and health and safety?
Good morning. Yep, I'm here. And hello, everyone. I apologize. I came from another meeting and logged on after the webinar had already started, but I think Jessica and Rebecca have been doing a wonderful job. So thank you. I'll just, kind of wrap this up here. So under IDEA, compensatory education is our legal remedy that's awarded to a student with a disability for a couple different reasons. Either the district erred, or they made an error, or they neglected to provide something that resulted in a denial of FAPE and created a loss of educational benefit. So the idea of compensatory awards are aiming to place disabled children in the same position that they would have been or would have occupied if it had not been as a result of the school district's violations of IDEA. So compensatory education services have to be based on applicable IDEA and state law and guidance. And the executive order in 2021-42 also address that districts shall, to the extent practicable and necessary, make individualized determinations whether and to what extent compensatory services may be needed in light of the school closures for the previous school year. Health and safety protocols. So we discovered not that long ago, unbeknownst to us, that the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and MDE jointly employ a school nurse consultant. And we had an opportunity to meet her and have conversation with her. She is a member of the Michigan Association of School Nurses and the American Academy of Nursing. And she has provided some wonderful resources for us. There are a couple links there that are some guidance resources. And I would also mention that Avelia has shared with us that the Michigan Association of School Nurses are working on developing some, a specific document, a document with recommendations specific to special education considerations. We don't have that yet, but as soon as we get it, we're gonna roll it out. So there's a couple great resources for you. Also, we're constantly trying to push our Ask MDEOS feedback form. There's a link there to it. It's on our website also, and we want to hear from you, any suggestions that you have regarding COVID-19 related topics. And anything that ISDs, districts, parents, students are facing out there in the field. You can identify yourself or not if you want a personal response back from the MDEOs. We need to know who you are and who to be able to respond back to. But the feedback form, we do get some really great suggestions from it. And we utilize opportunities for guidance that we can provide as a result of it also. But please use that feedback form. It helps us, and it helps us identify some of the themes that are going on around the state. And it you know, we'll answer any questions that we can or look into what we can for guidance related to COVID-19 questions. So I think that's it. I know we just have a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions?
We do have a couple of additional questions in the Q&A.
All right.
Jeremy Murphy asks, considering the logistical and budgetary constraints districts face, if a district is providing both in-school and remote learning options and parents are free to choose which option they access, how will staffing constraints that prevent the ability to access FAPE be addressed? For example, if the certified teacher is providing a full day of in-school instruction, but some of the remote learners need additional support from a certified teacher. The union contract may make it impossible for the needs of the remote learners to be met without hiring additional staff. How does MDE anticipate that these circumstances will be addressed?
Rebecca,
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, so a couple of things here. The IDEA does, you know, the administrative convenience and lack of personnel are not reasons for a lack of FAPE to be provided. So with that being said, there are always options. The district has the option to be proactive and working through those contingency learning plans to identify additional supports that can be provided, or additional staffing, whatever it is they're going to need to do, or discuss the need for some compensatory services, recovery services. And if all else fails, the parent does have that option to file a state complaint if they feel that there has been a denial of FAPE.
I think that was an excellent answer.
Okay, Heather writes, just to confirm what Ms. Brady said related to in-person learning. Are in-person learning opportunities only available for students with IEPs if/when in-person learning has been made available as an option to all students within a district?
Yeah,
Thanks for clarifying the corrections.
so if a region is in 4, 5, or 6 and a student with an IEP needs to have in-person, the district may need to provide in-person program services support for that student. I don't know, Rebecca, Jan, if you want to add to that, but if a student needs it, they may need to provide that service in person.
Okay, and last question, it's a lengthy one. The FAQ on page 12 mentioned that homebound is not allowed for schools in a region in phase 1, 2, or 3. EO 142 has no restrictions on in-person instruction. EO 160 and 161 provide that if work can be done remotely in either should or must be done remotely. Depending on the region's Michigan Safe Start phase designation. Under the Safe School Roadmap for schools in phase 1, 2, or 3, schools are required to be closed for in-person instruction. In this instance, the roadmap seems to contemplate schools as school buildings. With that understanding, the roadmap does not prevent school personnel from providing in-person instruction. What prevents schools from arranging for homebound services that cannot be provided remotely to a student to provide that student a FAPE? The roadmap still contemplates school personnel making home visits when a school is in a region in phase 1, 2, or 3. See page 18, where schools are strongly recommended to communicate with families by any means, including home visits.
So again, I think I would have to familiarize myself with 160 and 161. I'm more familiar with 142. So, but what was that?
I just said, yes, we'll take a look at that.
Yep, so we can take a look at that. But keeping in mind, and this came right out of our first guidance that we issued back in April, that even looking back at OSEP's guidance, keeping the health and safety of students and staff in mind first and foremost. There may be situations where homebound services cannot be provided, or home instruction within the home cannot be provided. So, and I believe one of our guidance documents, we recommended that districts consult with their local health departments to, in regards to that. And I think that's probably the best answer we have on that at this time.
No further questions in Q&A.
Sorry, what was that, Jessica?
We'll look at Executive Order 160 and 161.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one thing, Tedra, that I would like to, if I can just give a little plug, the MDEOS is doing something we've not done in the past, and we are hosting a parent, families, advocate focused webinar on Monday, September 14th from 1 to 2:30. So we have had information go out last week, and we're sending that out again today with the registration form. So if possible, I'd love to be able to share that link with you if you could include it on your page.
Definitely, if you send it to me, I will get it out.
Okay.
We'll share it on our Facebook, and we'll send it out on our email list.
And I think today, close of business today, is the deadline for actually registering for that also.
Okay, well, all
We need
right,
to-
we'll work on that. We might extend it.
Yeah, see if we can
Okay.
extend that.
Okay.
Tedra,
Great.
thank you for having
Yes.
us.
Thank you, ladies, so much for joining us. You gave us some really good information. You answered a lot of really good questions. I'm hoping that if people want to further engage or have further questions, that they will utilize your feedback form.
All right, perfect. We thank you very much for the opportunity.
We really
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah,
this. And the recording and the guidance will be up on the web page early next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.